Welcome to How to Decorate from Ballard Designs, a weekly podcast all about the trials and triumphs of decorating and redecorating your home. I'm Caroline. I'm on the marketing team.
And I'm Taryn, and I'm a product designer.
I'm Liz. I head up the creative team.
We're your hosts. Join the expert team at Ballard Designs for tips, tricks, and tales from interior designers, stylists, and other talents in the design world.
Plus, we'll answer your decorating dilemmas at the end of each episode.
We love answering your questions, so don't forget to email us at podcast@ballarddesigns.net.
Now, on with the show. Welcome back to the show. I'm Caroline, and I'm here with Liz.
Hi.
And we have a very special guest, New York-based designer and author Brittany Bromley. She's known for her traditional take on interiors with layers of pattern and unique details. Her spaces are warm, luxuriously detailed, and brimming with timeless patterns and antiques. Her work has been featured in publications like Elle Decor, Traditional Home, Veranda, and House Beautiful. And this spring, she released her first book, Relaxed Elegance, from Rizzoli. Brittany, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Are you available to come on the road with me? I love that introduction.
Absolutely. You know what? I would love the airplane points. No, I just was delighted to get your book. Obviously, the cover is so pretty. It's, very blue and white. My favorite part was you opened with your own home, which you say 15 different contractors told you to run from. And of course, you didn't. So I loved, and the reason I loved it is just because I often find that designers own houses give us such a peek into what really interests them and their personalities. And so I love that was sort of the opening kind of glimpse. And then it really flowed into all of your client projects. So maybe you can just start with your house. What drew you to it? What was your vision? And we can go from there.
Well, apparently what drew me to it is that I'm stubborn, because to have so many different professionals tell me that I should think otherwise and then to do it anyway must mean that I have like an innate prove you wrong sort of gene. But what I really loved about it to me is that it felt like it had bones that were traditional and historic, and therefore to me felt very relevant. And so even though it was suffering from, we sort of term a case of benign neglect, I could see underneath it that there was so much there and so much beauty, and it really felt like a challenge and an exciting one at that.
What were some of the things that you were being told, like reasons to not get this house? Because it's a stunning home. You've really turned it into something amazing.
Thank you. There were entire rooms that hadn't had heating in several years. So sort of the idea that they were living in a very small portion of the home, and therefore what had been neglected had been really neglected as it relates to being either exposed to the elements, or I remember once a contractor, after looking at the roof, told me that he had seen a lot less layers in a Subway sandwich. So there were all sorts of things about it that would make a more cautious home buyer beware. But we were sort of just entranced by it and loved the challenge of bringing back some of that historic beauty.
To say that you've customized every room of this house is an understatement, and for our listeners who haven't seen the book yet, there's just so many, and I said luxurious details in the introduction because that truly is what it is, and just very intricate, tiny little details that maybe on their own could be easy to not notice, but when all brought together, it just creates this really, really special, like every room. And I think we have to start with the dining room, right? Because of all the sculptural paper mache. So maybe kind of talk to us about your vision and how you just started layering all of the elements together.
Well, first of all, I would say to your point, it's probably very much an occupational hazard for a designer to spend any appreciable amount of time in a space and not to constantly be conceptualizing how you could add on to it or change it or make it better. So that's definitely something that comes from spending a lot of time in a space. The dining room was one of the most recently completed spaces. And I say that because that iteration is probably the most recent thing that I've done to the home. And it is very much a connecting space in our home. It connects the front hall where we have our staircase and our center hall colonial to the kitchen. And because of that, it is a room that we pass through probably 65 times a day. So it needed to be something that felt comfortable in that regard. So we wanted it to feel like you were able to walk through it. And because we live in a more rural location, the idea of bringing the outside in always really appealed to me. And our really dear friends at Casa Gusto had just installed their first paper mache paneling in their shop in West Palm. And I saw what they were capable of doing with that 3D paper mache. And from there, it was sort of off to the races to figure out how we could use that to sort of have this be a room that felt like an experience each time you pass through it.
And it's stunning.
It definitely feels like an experience. I mean, there are sculptural paper mache flowers and leaves coming out of everywhere.
Yeah. Can you describe it just for our listeners?
Sure. It does feel very magical. So the entire thing is rendered in paper mache. And what that allowed us to do was to create boiserie paneling. So the entire room is done in a series of 67 panels, which are all numbered and pre-measured. And the reason that it's important for them to flow in a consecutive order is because the design in that room was based off of a tree of life motif. And so that organic nature of that tree and the vines that come from it actually move all the way around the room in a sequential order. And then we have this really cool tile ceiling, which is also paper mache. So it pulls in a little bit of color into what is otherwise a very monotone space. And my girls, and I think several people that have visited because I entertain in there often, have said that it has almost an ethereal quality to it.
Yeah.
It feels, my girls, of course, their frame of reference is slightly more literary and specific to their age group, but they always say when they first saw it, they said it feels like Narnia.
Yeah.
Which I'll take to be the 10 and 12-year-old version of it's magical.
Yeah.
Yes,
definitely.
definitely. I mean, it's truly three-dimensional paper mache plastered on every surface of the wall and ceiling. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Is it delicate? I would almost be worried I'd break it by just walking past it or something.
No, it's actually the exact opposite of delicate. And I would say that with total certainty that we have indeed tried to break it. Because as I said, it's very much a pass through and we are not precious people.
Yeah.
And so because it's all articulated on wires, this paper mache is actually quite durable. And then the other thing I would say about it, which I really love, is that because it is wire and therefore fully moldable and can be bent and moved, that if there's a vine that happens to be in your way and you would prefer it not to be, you can always bend it up or bend it back or change sort of the contour of the way the leaves fall against the paneling. And obviously, as a designer who likes to tweak things, this could be a full-time job for me.
I hadn't even thought about that. Wow. Was there because there's this three-dimensional vine crawling off the wall, there's not really an opportunity to add, like a sideboard or a lot of other furniture. Was that something that you took into consideration? How did you kind of work around that? Is that like...
Actually, that was very much an 11th hour decision and perceptive on your part to have called me out on that, because originally I had thought that one of the largest walls in that room would receive this really beautiful black chiffonade break front to house another sort of occupational hazard, which is my China collection. But once we had the Tree of Life motif up, it just became very clear that to cover that up in any way with any kind of furniture would be sort of a design tragedy. So we shifted lanes, as one does, and found furniture sort of that is much more lacy and allows a lot more negative space.
Mhm.
So we used an antique French potting table actually as a bar in that room.
Mhm.
So that is a functional but also decorative element. The table itself shrunk down in that room. It's a round and it has leaves. And we decided that it would be much more on a daily basis functional for us to have a smaller table in that space. And those are really the primary furniture elements in that
Mm.
room. And because there are so few of them, it both calls attention to them, but also allows the walls to speak in a way that they wouldn't if we hadn't done that.
Yeah, it's actually so smart for a room that you're, kind of referring to as a pass-through room, even though that implies that it is not as special as it is. In order to like have that movement, less furniture kind of probably helps. But without the furniture, how are you making your statement and like, making it special? So the wall really does a
It
lot of work
carries a
in it.
lot of
Yeah.
weight.
Yeah. Going even though into the hallway, like you've got these beautiful, talking about all of the details you've added in. I loved kind of hearing your crafty moments, doing the super glued ribbon on the wall. And like, where do some of these flourishes come from? Do you just sort of like, do they pop into your brain? Were you like, I need more heaviness on the wall and the staircase? Like, where did the sort of the initial idea come from?
So the initial idea for having climbing prints is hardly original. I think that's something that's a trope that's been used many times to great effect. But because this was a light colored wall covering and because the frames themselves and the prints themselves had some of those colors in them, I wanted to do something that allowed me to hang them in a double stack and that pulled the colors from those prints. And so I wanted to do sort of an old fashioned application of having it hung on a ribbon. Next came the craftiness because anyone will tell you that if I can't find something, then I will make it. And therefore, having those two unusual colors juxtaposed in the chocolate brown and the saffron yellow
Mhm.
was really important to my overall vision. So that's
Yeah.
where the glue gun came in.
Well, I love that you're like, I have a very specific thing that I need, and hell or high water, I'm going to make this thing because I can't find it.
That's exactly hell, high water, or numerous blisters, which
Yeah.
is normally the result of a glue gun session.
Oh my gosh. Well, you are clearly a lover of pattern and I mean, your own living room, but so many of your spaces are just expertly layered in pattern. And so I mean, we have to discuss that because I would love to kind of hear, your approach to pattern, not only where you start, but like what is it about pattern that is so essential in one of your spaces?
I think people are always asking, and I find it to be an answer that's a little bit mutable and therefore can't always transfer to every space. But I would say there are some guidelines when it comes to pattern mixing. So I always like to start with what we call our hero fabric, which is a multi fabric that's either floral or in some cases geometric, but most often floral that has several colors in it. And it's something that you really respond to and you love, and you understand that it's sort of the guiding light for that space. And then from that point, you've dictated your color palette with that fabric. And then you pull from there, to me, some sort of like standard elements. So I would say if it's a multi-floral that you've started with, then you're looking at a geometric. Then you're looking at a solid. A geometric scent can sometimes be either like an abstract hand block batik. And if that's the case, then I'll often wave in something that's more traditional, like a ticking stripe or a gingham. And from there, I like to bring in texture because texture to me is really important. And because it is often found in natural materials, it gives all of those patterns a moment of quiet relief, a grounding. And I think those elements are the most important when it comes to pattern play. But I would say this sort of undefined, like je ne sais quoi in each of those spaces is something to which you gravitate naturally and therefore have confidence in that it will work. Because if you love something, I think there's an element of just going for it and saying, like, this works for me.
Well, I just love seeing them all together. And like there was one, I think it was your Poundridge project with the living room with the double sofas that were back to back. Um, you know, Overall, the effect is so light and airy and I wouldn't necessarily say calming, I guess, because there is a lot of energy, but like it's so open, you know, but there are so many patterns. I mean, there's the sort of geometric neutral on the chairs, there's the floral on the sofas, there's the ottoman, and they're all kind of in the same color palette. There's also a wallpaper. So, do you do you find that people are ever, concerned, or do you ever worry like it's, going to be too much, or these aren't all going to work together, I guess?
So I never worry about whether or not the multitude of patterns will work out, but I have had times where clients have been less sure of the outcome. And I would say that I would never sort of die on the hill for something unless I thought it was going to really work. And by that, I mean there are times in a project where hopefully you've built up enough creative capital with your clients that if you say, you need to trust me, this will work out
Mm.
and you'll love it, that they agree.
Yeah.
And I don't think you get to use those cards all the time,
Mhm.
but when you do play them, hopefully you play them to great effect.
Yeah. So, okay, because there's so many patterns in this one room in particular, but the overall feel is not at all heavy, not at all overdone. Like, how do you think that that is? What is it that you've done in here to use so much, but it feel like not so much? Does that make sense?
Well, I would see there's like a little bit of a lot.
Yeah.
I would say one of the things about this space is that it is a large room,
Mhm.
right? So you start with that. Then you look at the architectural significance and sort of elements. You have a lot of really wonderful windows and doorways. You have some architectural interest in the columns. You have a non-rectilinear room in the sense that there's a sort of alcove off of it. And then you have a central frame in that space, which is the mantle. So, taking into account all of that, I would say you start with the wall covering, which is the understanding that you don't have that much of it in between each of these really large windows. And so it needs to work for you, but not be overpowering, such that you're missing being able to trace that pattern around the space. So we chose a hand block batik because it gave us textural interest and also a repetitious pattern that you wouldn't for the windows in between feel like you were missing the offshoot of the vine or something like that. From there, we did the hero fabric, which is the pierre frais that we used on the sofas. And I would say that fabric did a ton of things for us because it has a light grounding background, but it has really strong color. And so it allowed us to pull the chocolate brown, the coral, a little bit of the blue, and then, of course, that natural feeling. And from there, you sort of wave in things that make sense. In other words, the hand block batik on the chairs, the grounding element of the black, which you'll see throughout that space. And you pull those elements into each of these seating areas because ultimately this is a room that functions and is viewed as though it's three different spaces. It's two seating areas with different patterns and then the game chair area.
And I think you do something really beautiful with scale on those patterns too. So the batik that's on the chair feels like it's maybe a sister or a cousin to the pattern that's happening on the walls.
Yes.
Because they're both geometric, they're both kind of the same neutral vibe to them, but the scale really kind of helps bring them together and help them stand apart.
I think you're absolutely right about that. The scale of all of these things is very important. If we had had a super small scale on those chairs, as we chose for that ottoman, they would have read from a distance more like a solid.
Mhm.
And we needed them to sort of read as though there was some pattern involved.
you mentioned the room being so large. Is that one of the reasons that you needed more pattern in there? Like, it sort of adds volume and
Yes and no. I would say there, in my opinion, there's probably a zillion different ways you could have done that room. And also, then again, in my opinion, to various levels of success, right? But to me, it felt important that those spaces were chunky enough that they felt like you'd arrive somewhere, so that one side of the sofa sitting area wasn't have and the other was have not, either as it relates to the floor plan, meaning having enough seating for everyone, or as it relates to the fact that each of those were strong enough to stand up to the repetitious nature of having those two sofas be covered in the same thing in two different seating areas.
Mhm. I love the back-to-back, sofas in there just functionally, but I was curious, it looks like you're sort of walking into the sides of the sofas, right? So you're kind of walking in and then you have to pick, like, right or left because the sofa's in the way. Is that ever a consideration? Like, I think if, I'm not you, but if I were designing this room, like, that would have worried me a little bit, like, walking in and then having a stop, but maybe that's not, like, I mean.
So you'll actually see in the book, there are, as I said, a lot of doors and windows in this room. So the primary way that this room is accessed is from that front hall.
Mhm.
And from the front hall, you're actually faced with only one of the sofas. And then beyond that, you see the second seating area and the mantle. So you aren't really walking into the side of it, but even if you were, I think that's where form and function have to marry.
Mhm.
And that, in my opinion, is one of the reasons why we chose on one of those seating areas to have a really comfy plush ottoman where you could put a drink down and put your feet up, and it's a little bit more relaxed. Those chairs, in spite of being small scaled, are very comfortable. And then on the other side of the seating area, it gets a little bit more formal.
Mhm.
That's where you might entertain. There's a beautiful coffee table that's perfect for hors d'oeuvres and drinks. And then you have inlaid chairs that have a little bit more of a, you've arrived sort of a vibe
Yeah.
to them. And so you separate out a little bit the function of those spaces so that you gravitate towards one or the other.
Yeah. I just thought it was such a smart move and something that the average person doing their own house wouldn't because they would like be blocked by that idea of it's going to make it feel smaller when sometimes making it feel smaller is a good thing. And I think
Yeah.
like House Hunters, for example, or, design shows has made us all feel like we have to always make our room feel bigger.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not a bad thing to make it feel smaller in some ways, by,
Yeah, and parse it out into sort of usable
yeah,
zones. You have a room that size, and I think if we hadn't put a game table over in the alcove, they may never have walked over there.
right. Yeah. Well, I just loved all of the pattern in the book because, I think for a while now, maybe the last in like all of the 2000 sort of tens, there was so much solid and so much, neutrals and solids and which are beautiful, but we kind of I don't know. I feel like there's been a fear of pattern. And so I love seeing all of the pattern, not only because in many ways functionally, it's easier to live with, like more forgiving, but it's just so
Yes.
much more fun and so much more exciting.
And very personalized. I would say the one thing about sort of the aughts as it relates to design trends is when it did feel like there was a lot of gray and white. I suppose you really could be the person that loves gray and white, but it was being used in such profusion that it made it difficult to believe that it was what everyone was gravitating
Yeah.
towards. Whereas having more color and more pattern allows a specificity that feels very personalized.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I took away from this book is that there's so much pattern and there's such a fearlessness with your use of pattern that it started making me go around my house and be like, okay, well, where can I be fearless with pattern and
Mhm.
how can I add some more things? And I just feel like that's always a good success for a design book. It's I
Yeah.
I
start
love hearing
redesigning my own home while I'm
I
Totally.
love
looking into a book.
hearing that. That makes me so happy.
I wanted to talk about the Hampton residence. I thought that that was such a fantastic use of pattern, but also humor. I feel like in some of the pieces and choices. And one of the things that I also noticed, because you've got playfulness, you've got sheep in the entry, you've got a bit of tradition with a portrait of a gentleman that's kind of given a side eye. There's a lot of humor going on there, but a lot of tradition. What were your thoughts when you were doing this home?
I think that it is always fun to have clients that are willing to, not just willing, but encouraging you to sort of conceptualize it from start to finish. And this was a really wonderful project for that reason, because they really trusted our vision. And because of that, it felt like we were sort of doing things with like a wink and a nod, that allowed it to feel, as you said, a little bit more lighthearted. So, for instance, in that entryway, the juxtaposition of what would be a very traditional sort of ancestor style portrait with these very like sort of modern Lolland-esque black sheep just felt like a really interesting moment. And pairing all of that with this sort of antique inlaid, very like irreverent front hall table, all of it together just felt really interesting. And I would say that throughout the house, there was sort of that capability to sort of be like, well, what would be interesting to do in this space as opposed to just pleasing?
Yeah. There were some other things about this project that made me kind of stop and recognize some things that you've done in some other projects as well. Um, and I think for here, it was the scale of art and mirrors. In the living room of this home, it has, the double height ceilings in the living room. And you just went huge, huge with these botanical prints, and then stack them. And then over the mantle, there's a giant mirror. And it also, I think, does that play with a little bit of humor, with something that feels like it should be a precious small botanical. How'd you go about the the living room?
So the living room was sort of like a guiding light for the entire project, in that this home is in the Hamptons. It was very light, very white, and a lot of white when we took on the project. So the first thing that we really wanted to do in this great room was to warm up those walls, and in doing so, call attention to some of the things that, someone might have looked at as being possible obstacles, but to us felt more like opportunities. In other words, that you have this really big climbing wall and have really interesting shaped windows, and then a roof line that cuts through all of that, and a mantle that looks like, you might be able to roast a boar in it. I mean, all of those things scale wise were really unusual. And so turning that on its head, making that have that natural faux bois wall covering, that was the beginning of warming that space up. And then, as you suggest, taking something that's traditionally quite diminutive and often very feminine and rendering it in grand scale appropriate to that of the boar roasting fireplace mantle, and then calling attention with the contrast in the molding in the windows around that fireplace allowed us to make that a focal point as opposed to something that would detract from the rest of the space.
I loved that room for the, I think, example that people can take from it. We get so many questions about double height living rooms. I think for the non-designer, but someone who's trying to make sense of the space, it's so challenging. And you know
Yeah, this felt masterful.
yeah, because and we kind of talked about this actually on a recent episode. The everything on the wall is very overscale, right? The art, the mirror, the even the light fixture, but then all of the furniture is normal human scale, which
Hmm.
I think often people almost get that backwards. Like they want to fill this huge sectional in a room like that. And then they put like teeny tiny art over the mantle. And it's like, no, like you're going to drown in the sofa and then you're never going to fill up any wall. And like you're doing it backwards.
I would always rather have traditionally scaled furniture and more of it
Hmm.
than something that's so large that you'll never use it again. And this room presented an opportunity and a challenge because it's a great room. So it is open to the kitchen, it is open to the front, and it's open to the sunroom. And so every one of those angles, when it came to conceptualizing this floor plan, had to be considered. So there had to be a delineating element coming from the kitchen towards that seating area. And that's where we use the console with the pair of stools and the pair of lamps. Conversely, we didn't want you to feel obstructed the way energy moves through a space from that entry hall looking towards the beautiful sunroom. And so choosing a sort of daybed style sofa allowed that side of the square to be open. And then the same really coming from that sunroom back into that great room. We have low scaled chairs in there. And I would say the other really crucial thing that we did in this space, and I remember actually marking up a photograph to show my clients what I was trying to convey in words, is that when we took on the project, that sunroom window was white,
Hmm.
as were the walls around it. And so there was no understanding of how it related architecturally to the room or the space outside. And so I remember marking up in black on a photograph showing my clients what I thought we should do. And that is the direct view from that entryway out that window. And I remember describing it to them. And I believe this is what it did for the space as imagine what it would feel like if you didn't have any eyebrows and then you had eyebrows. They're framing things out in a way that's really important and you don't even realize you're missing it until they're gone. And that's what the black trim around that window did.
Hmm.
It's so gorgeous. And
Yeah.
for our listeners, this window takes up the entire wall. It's just this window on that wall that framed out in the painted black. And it seals the deal on this whole room.
I'm so glad that you like it. I thought it turned out very nicely too. And I know that framing out that view for something that is often a seasonal residence it's really important.
Yeah. Well, I loved this house because we haven't really talked too much about color, but you're definitely not afraid of color. This house in particular had so many great examples of neutrals and it done in a really interesting, fun, layered, textured way. And if you have any kind of suggestions for people who love neutrals, maybe aren't really ready to go full color in their space, but how can they make their rooms more interesting and not just kind of sticking to like something that will
Grayish.
yeah.
I would say that my best advice in that department, and it's really evidenced by this project, is that you can have color without it being a primary color application. And so instead of, we go back to the Crayola box, instead of choosing a cobalt, which has a ton of color value and is really bold, you might choose like a duck egg blue that has a little bit more yellow and blue in it and reads as more of a muted color. And I would say we did that throughout this project. So it's a Delft blue, a duck egg blue, a persimmon coral, um, a green that is so dark it's almost black, but that's a color complexity that as the day goes on, you start to see the different tones. A blushy pink, a sagey green. So none of those are what we would term as being true colors. They're very much permutations of color. And that is often perceived, I think, to be a much more sort of like shallow end application of color. And it is extremely effective.
You've used tons of neutrals, tons of textures, and you've woven the color in kind of accents, but the colors that you've used, yes, are very muted and they're like the neutral of the color on the color, right?
That's
Like
right.
they're the neutral version of the color. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Because then your room has the energy that color is going to bring it, but the overall effect is still really kind of streamlined and calming and like serene and the things you're kind of looking for with a neutral space, but
And it's just a
decor.
really nice way to sort of experiment. I mean, you can start with a room that's largely neutral and weave in a sagey green and weave in a, sort of Delft blue and not feel bowled over by the color value that those represent relative to everything else around it.
Uh-huh. Do you think you're talking about color value? Do you think it makes sense to stay in the same value? Like if you're using, say, a mid-tone kind of brown as your main neutral, do you then use mid-tone like coral or blues, or can you
I
go up or
hate
down?
I hate to constrict anybody, especially the viewers like that. I think it's all relative to that to which you gravitate. In
Uh-huh.
other words, an example in this project would be in the bedroom where I did a very neutral grass cloth wallpaper, has a little bit of reflectivity to it, a lot of warm wood, and then we chose a multi that had a Delft blue and a charcoal and a little bit of a gray black. But then we popped everything in that space by choosing something that had a major color value, which is that sort of mustard saffron color that we wove into there. And in my opinion, if we didn't have the mustard and saffron, then the other things wouldn't have been nearly as interesting without the juxtaposition.
I am obsessed with that fabric, that floral in that room. It's so pretty. It's
I
so
love it too.
pretty.
I love it so
Colors,
much.
the brown. Oh, yeah.
It's honestly very difficult to find a fabric that has all of those colors in it. The Delft blue, the soft sage blue, the yellow, the charcoal, the brown. All of those things are just really interesting.
It's really lovely. You have such a unique eye for pattern. A lot of the patterns are not super prevalent, I think, in other design work, which I think really makes the spaces feel unique and special because, it's not full of things that you've seen before. It's really
I like that. That makes me very happy because obviously, like everyone that loves design, I spend a lot of time looking at what other people do. And so while I'm often inspired by it, I hope I'm never just patterning anything after it. So that's a very, very nice compliment.
well,
Thank
I'm
you.
sure you really have to go out of your way to find new things and, search for new fabrics that are,
Well,
you know,
honestly, textile designers have made our lives so much more interesting in the last 5 or 6 years. I would say the sort of advent of the ability to have small batch production, these much smaller, more independent fabric lines. It feels to me as though it's really opened up a door to
Mhm.
talent that before now might have been something that didn't have the ability to create an audience.
Are these mostly like digital printing when
I
you say
think it's
small
both,
batch?
to be
Both.
honest with you.
Yeah.
I think there is the digital printing aspect of it, but I think whether that's computer assisted drawing has allowed you to create it. And because you're able to print it in smaller batches, you're not necessarily beholden to the same production
Yeah.
requirements that you would be for, 500 yards or 50 bolts or whatever it
Yeah.
used to be. And if you just think about how much fabric you would have to be shilling to the world to have 500 bolts be your normal order
Yeah.
versus 5 bolts, you think about how much more simple it is than it used to be to have something that people haven't seen before.
Yeah. And I guess maybe 20 years ago, you would have to go to, an ADAC or the Design Center in New York to get represented. And now you can just reach out to designers probably online and say, hey,
Directly,
can I send
yes.
you
Mhm.
my swatches? Yeah.
And I love that more than anything. I would say
Mhm.
we have discovered some amazing textile lines. And that to me is a great joy and a great sort of capability that both social media and just in general, the World Wide Web, as my dad calls it, has brought to all of us. It's the great equalizer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I guess I never really thought about it changing the textile industry in that way, but that makes so much sense. Okay, you are a major lover of the natural fiber rug. Tell us about this.
It's true. I've barely ever met one I don't like. I'll tell you what. I mean, I am a mother of pets and a mother of children, and both of those things tend to be messy versus clean.
Hmm.
And so a natural fiber does so much from a standpoint of tonal variation and also just forgive everything that goes down on it. And in particular, in my mind, I like Sisal. It's a little bit stricter. It's like the slightly more uptight teacher, but I prefer Jute. Jute's like the substitute teacher that's like, yeah, we can have class outside. Um, and I love that because my children spill constantly and my animals do things I wish they wouldn't do indoors. And, we have all of those things. And because that has movement and the jute is really soft underfoot. That's another thing I would say. Your
Yeah.
mother's natural texture rugs were not something you would want to pat around barefoot on. Whereas I would say this generation's, particularly jute, are really, really soft underfoot. Whenever I propose it for a project, I always encourage them to take their shoes off and step on it because it is actually very comfortable.
Yeah.
And the title of my book is Relaxed Elegance. And what is important about that to me is that nothing feels too precious. And so not having to worry about my children or my dogs or my clients' children or dogs, or even just my clients dropping a strawberry popsicle on the rug and running the entire space. That's the definition of that to me, is that it's not precious. You are able to live in these spaces and enjoy them without having to worry about stain treating every last thing, starting with the rug.
Yeah, I will say you use some very fine antiques, some very fine fabrics and beautiful fabrics, a lot of traditional elements that might, I suppose, be interpreted as more formal. And so that natural fiber rug really kind of cuts it all and brings it that relaxed vibe that obviously love and
I
named your book
do. I
for.
do. I love it so much. I love it so much. I wrote a book about it. But I will say the other thing that I will often do, and I also think this is really interesting, is that I don't ever want a space that we design to feel like we just popped it in, like we're popping an ice cube out of a tray.
Mm.
I really want them to feel like they have patina and they're layered and they reflect the interests of the people that live there. And to me, one of the ways that you do that is the understanding that a room is often built over time. It's things you've collected. It's things you brought back on your travels. It's something you hadn't seen before that you just brought in. And because of that, I think layering rugs, starting with a natural texture like a jute, and then layering a durry or something you found in your travels or a benyara or like any of those things that sort of reflect that layering capability, then your room really starts to feel collected. And that to me is what we always want for any project. I never want anyone to walk in and say, "Oh, you just redecorated. How lovely."
Right.
Well, that's one of the things that stuck out to me too, is that there were some fabrics that you mixed in that felt like they were sun drenched already or like bleached a little bit, or the outdoor furniture was worn in a way that made it feel like it was already there for a few seasons. So they didn't feel like they were, just
That's
that whole,
exactly
this
right.
is just fun.
I love a patina, as
Yeah.
they say. I really do. I think it makes everything more interesting. I like antiques. I like it when things have little bits of wear. I often, particularly in my own home, won't repair a water spot or worry about a marble spot where it's taken the finish off of it. And I always say, just on the subject of marble, the best thing to do, because we do a lot of kitchens, and marble is a living finish in the sense that it interacts with the environment around it, but it is an organic finish in that it is often has color variation, movement in the slabs themselves, and I love that. And so when people say something to me like, "Well, I'll be so nervous to cook on there," or "I'm just worried of what it will look like if I put this down and there's an etch mark," the best possible scenario for someone who put in marble, which is what I did the day mine went in the kitchen, open up 8 cans of crushed tomatoes, pour the tomatoes all
No, you did
over.
not.
Oh,
Yes, I did.
Oh,
Pour the tomatoes all over the countertop and then get out a new sponge and put it all into the disposal. Because that level to me of worrying about your countertop such that you don't want to cook there or you don't want to entertain there or you're constantly telling your children they need a coaster. That's not living to me.
okay. That is genius and also unhinged.
I know. Listen, I've often been accused of both, so
Oh my gosh, that is
consistent,
so
if
funny.
not nonetheless.
Oh my gosh, that is so funny. You didn't even make like a tomato soup, a tomato
Nothing.
sauce.
Nothing. And actually, now if I did it again, I'd probably use curry.
Oh my
That's true. That
God.
yellow.
Yeah,
Oh
that
my
yellow.
gosh.
The
But
turmeric will never
these
come out.
things, they just can't be precious, in my opinion. They really
Yeah.
can't be. Otherwise, you're not living with them.
Yeah.
We say in our house, and my children will repeat it to me anytime anything is stained or damaged, love people and use things and not the other way around. So if you're not enjoying your people,
I like that.
Yeah. Since we have a little bit more time, we didn't actually talk too much about color. And I wanted to ask you about color because there was one of the projects that, we talked about neutrals. You talked about pattern and how you kind of use your hero pattern to inspire the color palette. But that Park Avenue apartment had those incredible persimmon, coral orange. I don't know what color we would call it. Orange, I guess, really. Dining chairs. And they were so fabulous. It had this sort of just the lightest shade of blue you could possibly use on the walls. And the color in this project seemed to really stand apart from the rest of the houses in here almost. Like there was more saturation. They were almost more primary colors. So maybe kind of share a little bit about that and how you've used color in here differently than some of your other projects.
So I would say one of the things about this project, which was so wonderful, is that it was probably the fourth or fifth home that I've done for these clients. So when I refer to creative capital, which is what you hopefully accrue after asking someone to trust you on something and then finding that they do, is that you get a little bit more rope when you say, I think this would be really wonderful. And the wife has become an amazing, wonderful, dear, dear friend of mine, and they have an incredible art collection. And she, as we were conceptualizing, sort of giving this space new life after they purchased it, one of the things she said is that I want this to feel almost calming, like white. And she said, but then I want there to just be a few pops of color. And so we chose that really, really, I mean, for me, probably the quietest of the quiet wallpapers, which is that silk cream colored Pierre Frey. So it gave a little bit of texture to the walls. And then from there, the next sort of most important fabric was the very painterly fabric that we used from Pierre Frey, which almost feels in and of itself like an abstract painting. And those colors allowed us to pull just a few other pops of color in what is honestly very neutral space for us. And because the architecture of this home is sort of around a central gallery, meaning that formal living room is off of that gallery, the den is off of that gallery, and then the dining room is off of that gallery with very large public style openings to those spaces, they needed to all be able to relate and speak to one another. And so we once again chose in that dining room to do a very quiet, what we call almost like a whisper of blue on the walls in that lacquer. But then the pop is that chair. And I find it, and this probably goes back to my very first job, which was working at a cosmetic company where I had lots of interaction with makeup artists. And they taught me one of the most interesting juxtapositions in color palette is a cool and a warm. And they make both more interesting. And so this very cool toned wall in this whispery gray blue with this extremely warm coral persimmon color, it really just pops both of them actually in a very interesting way. And then of course, in that room, because it was visible many times from that gallery, instead of having just the solid color on the fronts and seats of those chairs, we chose to do a pattern on the back of the Empire style chair, because then it's interesting from the back as well as from the front.
I love that. Is it a flame stitch? Is it a chevron? I love the back of those chairs. I need that fabric.
It is a flame chevron pattern, but it doesn't have there's no embroidery to it. So it's a print.
It's so pretty. I love that. I mean, what a just wow moment. I mean, it's definitely a wow in the book when you turn the page, Um, but I have to assume it looks wow from in person as well.
It's very fun. And that's the other thing I would say. I love these clients so much, and they are fun and lighthearted. And I think this apartment, this home feels that way. And so it feels like them.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of that color in lots of the rooms. You had that little cerused oak armchair in the bedroom that had that color, that tortoiseshell library. I mean, with the chevron little sofa, there's a little bit of it in the living room, and
The
what
cutest
a
sleeper sofa that's ever been made.
oh, it was this
That's how we refer to
flavor.
it in our office. The best sleeper sofa ever.
Oh, I didn't know that. That
Oh,
is a great looking sleeper sofa. Yeah. But I love that your client asked for an all all white, and you're like, "You know what accent color we need is bright orange."
Yeah, still got to be me. No,
Amazing.
it is funny because it does what you're saying is correct, which is that the recipe isn't always the recipe. That, if you use a teaspoon, it isn't always better than a tablespoon.
Mhm. Yeah, and it really unites all of the spaces together and is such a fun and energizing accent color.
how does this space differ from the other spaces that you've done for that
Oh,
client?
yeah.
They're very different. And I would say that actually is something that makes sort of our lives in our firm so much fun and so interesting. And that is that because we now work all over, we are able then to participate in more of the common vocabulary of where we are. In other words, I believe that things should have a sense of place and time. And so, in other words, their home in, a more rural country location is very different than in downtown New York, as well it should be.
Mhm.
And so having a bit more formality, a bit more lacquer, a bit more antique, those are appropriate en situ, as opposed to in the country house where, you really want sort of a mud room that's an acre long and a zillion drawers in which to put your boots and wellies, and,
Mhm.
all of those things make much more sense. Um, as opposed to this space where you're, trying to figure out where you might want to make a martini.
Yeah, and you also have a office in West Palm. So how does your West Palm projects differ from your, New York and Connecticut projects?
Well, I always say that they are very different, right? Because I do believe in a sense of spirit and place. But I would say that there's usually a river that runs through it. And that is that while we may be able to use either a slightly different palette or a slightly different application, that there are consistent things throughout those, which is our use of color. Um,
Mhm.
the other thing I would say about having been in this industry now for some time and the evolution of it is the new selection that's now available to us of performance textiles that don't feel like outdoor fabric.
Yeah.
And that is an incredible gift, because whereas once we would put a boucle on a sofa and pray that no one ever used it, or scotch guard it and fiber seal it into submission, now we can use something that has a hand where it feels like it's indoor, but if someone pours something on it, it just beads right off of it. So particularly in Florida, where it's likely to be, a little wet tushy in a bathing suit, that's much appreciated.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, a lot has developed in the performance fabric world, but do you find yourself using more solids in West Palm just because there's a lot of pattern options, but maybe not quite as many as a non-performance fabric?
Yeah, I don't know if that's true, to be honest with you, because I would say that there are so many of our favorite fabric lines now that have introduced very similar, if not exactly the same, patterns in performance. And
Got it.
so,
Yeah.
faced with the option, I'm just using this as an example, but faced with the option in one of our favorites, Skylar Samperton, am I going to do it in the non-performance or the performance? I'm almost always going to recommend that we do it in the performance because, again, that's sort of the equivalent of pouring tomatoes on the marble countertop. Why worry about it?
Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah, it is so nice to live in that time where we can
It
have
really
the
is.
option. Yeah.
And it doesn't have, that's the other thing I would say. I mean, there were a lot of nice options for performance textiles. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to throw 2016 under the bus, but I would say that not knowing when you touch it, if something is performance, really feels like progress as a designer. The
Right.
hand has changed.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially if you've got a pattern and a performance, then, like, you're good. Because
As we say,
the pattern
win-win.
yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. Again, Relaxed Elegance. It was such a beautiful book, and your first book, are you gonna do another one?
I don't know. It's like asking someone right after they've had a child if they're going to do it again.
Yeah,
I
true.
think the answer is, of course.
Did you enjoy the process?
I loved the process, actually. I like it even more in retrospect. Honestly,
Yeah.
it was really rewarding. It was exciting for us to go back and revisit these projects from both a sort of editorial standpoint. In other words, thinking about what the aims and the goals and the sort of like
Mhm.
way that we arrived at the final design concept. So it was an opportunity for reflection in
Yeah.
a way that maybe we don't always get to do. But then also, I would say, the compilation of them is very satisfying, just to sort of like look at all of these things that we have been lucky enough to have a hand in creating as a compendium is, I mean,
Yeah.
that's about as good as it gets. It was awfully fun.
Yeah. Well, I so enjoyed it. I know our listeners will enjoy it. So thank you for coming to chat with us about it.
Thank you so much for having me to come and chat with you about it. This was really a wonderful way to spend the afternoon. I
Good,
look
good.
forward to seeing you both.
Yes. Before you go, will you tell everyone where they can find you and follow you and obviously pick up the book?
Absolutely. So they can find me on Instagram at Bitty Bromley. That's Bitty Bromley. For those of you that are wondering if that's my actual name, I will tell you that I am old enough to remember when Instagram was not your calling card to the world. And so that was my childhood nickname. And you can find us online at bbromley.com, and you can purchase our book, which is through Rizzoli, at a number of different places, hopefully starting with your local bookshop because we want to support them in every way possible.
Yeah.
And then if that is not feasible, I would suggest heading over to Amazon.com because I know Jeff has it.
Yep. Okay, talking about your name, I did have to like go do a double take and I was like, wait, this is the same person, right? Because I know I followed her on Instagram, but like that's this yeah. Anyway. So
Yeah,
I definitely almost called you Bitty several times.
That's a carryover, and I'll admit this on the record for the first time. When I was younger, my name was Brittany Horn, and I couldn't pronounce my R's, so I used to say I'm Brittany Han. And
Oh
so
my God,
Bitty
that's amazing,
became my nickname.
That's cute. Well, it's a
that's
great
sweet.
name, yeah.
Thank you.
And that's our show. You can find all of the show notes on our blog, howtodecorate.com/podcast.
To send in a decorating dilemma, email your questions to podcast@ballarddesigns.net so we can help you with your space.
And of course, be sure to follow us on social media at Ballard Designs.
Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And please leave us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback.
Until next time, happy
Happy
decorating!